A heartless millionaire abandoned his 4-year-old son in the middle of the mountains because the boy had a strange congenital disease. He didn't expect that as soon as he left, a strange engine noise was heard nearby, and then the chandeliers cast their golden glow across the ballroom, reflecting in the crystal glasses, clinking in delicate toasts. Soft laughter rippled through the air, mingling with the gentle hum of classical music. It was an evening of grandeur, of carefully orchestrated perfection, where power and influence danced beneath the surface of elegant conversation. The Astor estate was the epitome of old money, unshaken, untouchable. Every detail, from the imported floral arrangements to the silver-embroidered tablecloths, was designed to uphold the family's reputation. Tonight, Lawrence Astor stood at the center of it all, his presence commanding. He spoke with practiced ease, nodding at the right moments, indulging the egos of men who measured their worth by the weight of their wealth. His wife, Kathleen, stood a step behind, her smile poised, though her fingers trembled against the stem of her wine glass. And then, beyond the pools of warm light and polite society, in the quiet darkness just beyond the grand staircase, Jason watched. The 4-year-old did not belong among the glittering guests, and perhaps deep down, even he understood that. He pressed himself against the cold marble wall, peering through the gap between the banister's carvings, small hands gripping the polished wood as if holding on to something only he could see. His feet, clad in soft house slippers, barely made a sound. He had learned to be invisible. From his vantage point, he could see his father's hand, the way it moved in the air when he spoke, the firm grip of his fingers around a whiskey glass. There was a strength in it, one that held, one that crushed. Jason's own hands felt different, smaller, weaker. A waiter passed too close, and Jason pressed himself further into the shadow, his heart hammering. He wasn't supposed to be here. The staff had been instructed to keep him upstairs, tucked away where no one could whisper, "Is that the sick one?" But the house was vast, and curiosity had led him down winding hallways, away from his nursemaid's watchful eyes. Across the room, his mother glanced up suddenly, her gaze flickering toward the staircase. Jason stiffened. For a moment, he thought she had truly seen him, that she might cross the room, take his hand, lead him away before his father noticed. But Kathleen's expression barely shifted, just a flicker of unease, a hesitation that passed as quickly as it came. She turned back toward her husband, lifting her glass to her lips as if nothing had happened. Jason swallowed. His stomach felt strange, like it had folded in on itself. That night, after the guests had left and silence had settled over the grand estate, Jason lay curled beneath the heavy covers of his bed, his small chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the bedside lamp barely reaching the edges of the sprawling rug. The shadows felt heavier tonight, as if they knew something he didn't. And then it came. A violent tremor ran through his body, his limbs jerking against his will. His breath caught, strangled in his throat as his eyes rolled back, his tiny frame convulsing beneath the sheets. The seizure took him with no mercy. His hands twitched, his back arched, and a desperate sound, half whimper, half choked gasp, escaped his lips. The door burst open. His nursemaid rushed to his side, her hands fumbling to hold him still, her voice panicked as she called out for help. Jason couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly. He could only feel the sharp edges of the world slipping away, leaving nothing but a crushing weight in his chest. Then his father was there. Lawrence stood in the doorway, his silhouette rigid against the dim hallway light. For a long moment, he said nothing. He merely watched his son, small and writhing, helpless and weak. His fingers flexed at his sides. The seizure eased, leaving Jason limp, his body spent from the violence of it. He blinked up at his father, eyes dazed, searching for something he could not name. But there was no warmth in Lawrence's face, No relief. Just something cold. Something distant. Kathleen appeared beside him, her robe loosely tied, worry lining her features. She reached for Jason, but Lawrence caught her wrist. "We should have never let it get this far." His voice was quiet, firm, final. "Lawrence." "No." He cut her off, eyes never leaving the child in the bed. "You know what the doctors said. You know what this means." Jason's breath was still shaky, but he understood the tone, the edge in his father's voice that meant something irreversible. He curled his fingers into the bedsheets, small and trembling. Kathleen looked away, touching her stomach, a new hope for Asta, her expression unreadable. Lawrence exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face before turning away. "Now, we have a chance to correct this mistake." The door closed behind him. Jason did not cry. He simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of something he could not name pressing down on his chest. Even at 4 years old, he knew. He was not meant to exist. The house had grown quieter in recent months, not in the way a peaceful home should be, but in the way that a place empties itself of warmth, of meaning. The walls no longer carried laughter, only hushed conversations that stopped whenever Jason was near. The hallways, once familiar, now felt like corridors to nowhere. Outside, the world was shifting. The late autumn air had sharpened, the leaves turning brittle, their gold and crimson shades fading to brown. Jason watched them from his bedroom window, pressing his fingers against the cold glass, tracing the way the wind carried them away. He wasn't allowed to go outside anymore. At first, he had asked why. The nursemaid had fumbled for an answer, offering vague explanations about the weather, about how boys like him, weak boys, needed to stay inside where it was safe. But Jason had been outside before. He had run across the garden, let the sun warm his skin, and felt the grass between his fingers. Safe didn't feel like this. The meals came at set times, delivered on trays and placed near the door, as if he were some kind of sickness to be contained. His mother no longer tucked him into bed, no longer placed a cool hand against his forehead after a seizure. The space between them had widened, an invisible wall he could not cross. But Jason still tried. One evening, he ventured out of his room, barefoot on the carpeted halls, his steps light, almost hesitant. The house was dim, the light from the chandeliers soft and golden, flickering against the polished floors. In the drawing room, Kathleen sat near the fireplace, her back to the door, her hands resting over the gentle curve of her stomach. Jason's breath caught. He took a step forward, then another, the warmth of the fire reflecting in his wide, hopeful eyes. "Mother!" His voice was small and careful, like he had forgotten how loud he was allowed to be. Kathleen turned slightly, her expression unreadable. Jason hesitated, then slowly reached out, his fingers barely grazing the fabric of her dress. "I wanted to say hello to the baby," he murmured. "Will they like me?" Kathleen stiffened. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she gently moved his hand away. "It's late, Jason. You should be in bed." There was no softness in her voice, no warmth in her touch. Jason felt something tighten in his chest, something he couldn't quite name. He had expected... what? A smile? A reassurance that he would be a big brother? He had seen other mothers, how they looked at their children, how they held them, how they never pulled away. But his mother did not look at him like that. She looked past him, through him, as if he were something already gone. That night, as Jason lay in bed, staring at the shadows stretching across the ceiling, he listened. The walls carried sound, no matter how much people tried to whisper. His father's voice was sharp, deliberate. His mother's, quieter, but not uncertain. "We should have done this sooner," Lawrence said. "I cannot." Kathleen's voice wavered, but only slightly. Lawrence exhaled, a sigh of finality. "It's the only way." Jason curled into himself, pulling the blanket over his ears. He did not know what they meant, but he knew it was about him. The car ride was long, winding through unfamiliar roads that twisted into the mountains, the sky above them a dull grey. The trees lined the path like silent sentinels, their bare branches reaching toward the sky in crooked, skeletal patterns. Jason sat in the back seat, his small hands clutching a stuffed bear that had once been his favorite. The silence between him and his father was thick, pressing against his ribs, making it hard to breathe. Lawrence had not spoken much since they left. No explanations, no reassurances, just the steady hum of the engine, the rhythmic sound of tires against gravel. Jason watched his father's hands on the steering wheel, steady, controlled, fingers flexing slightly as if in thought. He had seen those hands before, gripping a whiskey glass, adjusting the cuff of an expensive suit, pushing him away. He looked down at his own hands, smaller, weaker. "Are we going somewhere special?" Jason asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Lawrence did not answer. The road narrowed, the car slowing as they reached a clearing. The trees stood taller here, their presence heavy, imposing. The air felt colder, the sky stretched too wide above them. Lawrence stepped out first. Jason hesitated before following, his slippers sinking slightly into the damp earth. The wind tugged at his clothes, threading its way through his hair, whispering things only the trees could understand. His father knelt down then, meeting Jason's gaze for the first time in months. Jason's heart lifted, just a little. Then Lawrence spoke. "Stay here." Jason blinked. "But—" Lawrence rose, turned, and walked away. The car door shut. The engine started. Jason took a step forward, confusion turning to something heavier. "Are we playing hide-and-seek?" he asked, his voice carrying into the empty air. The car moved. Jason ran toward it, small feet slipping on damp leaves. Wait, I don't—" The tires spun against the dirt. The car grew smaller, the red taillights blurred in the distance. And then, he was alone. The wind howled through the trees, curling around his small frame, pressing against his skin like an unwelcome embrace. He waited. The sky darkened. The cold deepened. The first snowflake fell. The wind howled through the treetops, carrying with it a biting chill that sank into Jason's bones. His slippers were soaked through, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. He had walked for what felt like hours, his small legs stumbling over roots and fallen leaves, his fingers stiff and trembling from the cold. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their twisted limbs reaching like silent watchers in the night. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know where to go. Douglas Carnegie was not a man prone to sentiment. He had spent a lifetime navigating the ruthless world of power, a world where men like Lawrence Astor thrived and families like the Carnegies were meant to fall. He had expected to find something useful tonight, dirt on Lawrence, a crack in his pristine reputation, something he could twist to his advantage. He had not expected this. Who would have thought that while spying on his enemy for a weakness, he would discover this cruel abandonment tonight? Douglas studied him for a moment before finally speaking. "Your father left you to die." The words were blunt, heavy in the space between them. Jason's grip on the fabric tightened, but he didn't flinch. Douglas tilted his glass slightly, watching the liquid swirl. "I don't pick up lost things for no reason, kid." He finally looked at him again, his gaze calculating. "Let's see how useful you can be." Jason did not reply. He only sat there, staring into the fire, trying to remember what warmth was supposed to feel like. The car was gone. His father was gone. He hugged the stuffed bear to his chest, its fabric damp and clinging to his skin. His fingers clutched at it desperately, as if it might somehow anchor him to something, anything that felt real. His lips trembled, but he did not cry. He had learned that crying didn't bring people back. A branch snapped somewhere behind him. His breath hitched. His small frame stilled, listening. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the whisper of wind weaving between tree trunks, the distant eerie calls of unseen creatures. But then came something different, something unnatural, the hum of an engine. Jason turned toward the sound, his legs unsteady as he pushed forward, drawn by the distant glow of headlights slicing through the darkness. The beam wavered, bouncing slightly, as if the car had been sitting idle for too long, its driver unsure. Through the windshield, a man sat in the driver's seat, his face partially illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard. He wasn't looking at Jason. He was speaking, low and serious, into a phone. Then he looked up. Their eyes met. Jason froze, gripping his bear tighter. The driver didn't move for a moment, his sharp gaze assessing the small, shivering child before him. Then, slowly, he spoke into the receiver. "He's here." A pause. "Yeah, I'll bring him." The door opened with a metallic creak. Jason took a step back, the damp leaves crunching beneath his feet. The driver stepped out, tall and imposing, his dark coat fluttering in the wind. He exhaled, rubbing his gloved hands together as if contemplating something. Then he crouched to Jason's level. "You must be freezing, kid." His voice was gruff, edged with something Jason couldn't quite name. Jason hesitated. The man sighed, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, wrapped piece of chocolate. He unwrapped it and held it out. "Eat." Jason eyed it warily. The driver didn't press. "Suit yourself." He straightened, glancing back toward the car. "But you won't last long out here. It's getting colder." Jason's fingers curled around his bear, uncertain. The man didn't reach for him, didn't force him. He simply turned toward the open car door, nodding toward the seat. "You can come, or you can stay." Jason looked past him at the trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. He knew what staying meant. Slowly, he stepped forward. The man nodded, helping him climb into the back seat, then shut the door. The warmth of the car was immediate, suffocating after the relentless chill of the forest. The smell of leather and faint traces of cologne filled the space, foreign yet oddly grounding. The driver slid into his seat, pulling the car into motion with an effortless ease. Jason's head rested against the window, the glass cold against his temple. "Where are we going?" His voice was barely above a whisper. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Home." Jason woke to the soft crackling of a fire. The air smelled different here. Wood smoke, faint traces of something rich and unfamiliar. His body felt heavy, wrapped in a thick blanket, though his clothes were still damp. He blinked, his vision adjusting to the dim light. The room was warm, lit only by the glow of the fireplace, its flickering shadows stretching across the wooden floors. And then he saw him. A man sat across the room, reclining in a leather chair. His presence filled the space effortlessly, radiating an air of quiet authority. His dark hair was combed back neatly, his sharp features betraying little emotion. A glass of amber liquid rested in his hand, though he seemed in no rush to drink it. Douglas Carnegie. Jason didn't know who he was, not yet, but Douglas knew exactly who Jason was. The child sat up slightly, fingers curling around the blanket. He felt small beneath the weight of the man's gaze. Douglas studied him for a moment before finally speaking. "Your father left you to die." The words were blunt, heavy in the space between them. Jason's grip on the fabric tightened, but he didn't flinch. Douglas tilted his glass slightly, watching the liquid swirl. "I don't pick up lost things for no reason, kid." He finally looked at him again, his gaze calculating. "Let's see how useful you can be." Jason did not reply. He only sat there, staring into the fire, trying to remember what warmth was supposed to feel like. The fire cast long, restless shadows across the room. Jason sat upright, his small frame barely making an impression against the oversized leather chair. The warmth of the blanket draped over him should have been comforting, but it only made the coldness inside him more apparent. Across the room, Douglas Carnegie watched him carefully. The man had not spoken since Jason had woken up, nor had he moved from his seat. His fingers toyed with the rim of his glass, the amber liquid inside barely disturbed. Jason, in his 4-year-old understanding of the world, knew better than to speak first. "Drink," Douglas finally said, nodding toward the glass of water set on the table beside him. Jason hesitated before reaching for it, his fingers still stiff from the cold. The water tasted strange, metallic against his tongue, but he drank anyway. Douglas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't ask where you are." Jason lowered the glass. "Does it matter?" His voice was hoarse from the cold, from exhaustion, from something deeper that even he didn't understand. Douglas studied him for a moment longer before sitting back. "You're smarter than you look." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. Jason did not ask why he had been brought here. He did not ask about his parents. A part of him knew, even at his young age, that there was no going back. That night, he curled beneath the thick blankets in the unfamiliar room, but he did not sleep. Days turned into weeks. Jason learned the patterns of the house, the voices of the people who worked for Douglas, and the way the man himself moved, slow and deliberate, like someone who never wasted a single motion. Douglas did not speak often, and when he did, his words were precise. He did not coddle Jason, did not indulge in any of the warmth Jason had once associated with adults. But he did provide. Food appeared at the correct times. Clothes that actually fit him replaced his tattered ones. Books, more than toys, found their way into his room. But Jason never asked for anything. He ate what was given, wore what was provided, and read what was placed before him. He never asked about his parents, and Douglas never spoke of them. One night, it happened again. Jason had felt the heaviness creeping into his limbs all evening, the familiar tightening behind his eyes, the way the world seemed to slow and tilt at strange angles. But he had ignored it. He had learned, through whispered warnings from his old nursemaid, that his sickness made people uncomfortable. So he forced himself to sit still, to keep his breathing even, to pretend he was fine. But his body betrayed him. It started with a tremor in his fingers, barely noticeable at first. Then his vision blurred, the edges of the room smearing together. His chest tightened, his limbs locked, and before he could even register what was happening, he was falling, convulsing against the floor, the world vanishing into violent white noise. When Jason woke, the fire had burned lower, casting weak shadows against the walls. His limbs felt like lead, his breath was shallow, and his head was aching. Someone was in the room with him. Douglas. He wasn't sitting in his usual chair, nor was he standing over Jason in concern. He was simply there, leaning against the desk, arms crossed, watching. "You should have told me." Jason swallowed, his throat raw. He knew what Douglas was talking about. Douglas exhaled, long and slow. "You're sick." Jason's fingers clenched into the sheets. "I don't want to be." The man let out something that almost sounded like a laugh. Dry, humorless. "Not much choice in that, kid." Jason didn't respond. Douglas studied him for a moment longer, then pushed off the desk, moving toward the door. "You'll see a doctor in the morning. Someone who knows what they're doing." Jason blinked. He had expected something else. Anger, disgust, even indifference. But Douglas wasn't leaving him to die. The door shut behind him, and Jason was alone again. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was disappearing. The doctor came. Jason sat still as they examined him, poked at him, and asked him questions in that same careful way all doctors did, as if the words mattered more than the person. Douglas stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He never left the room. The diagnosis was clear: epilepsy. The treatment plan was more complicated, but Douglas listened, nodding at the necessary moments. He didn't rush. He didn't dismiss. Jason, for the first time, wondered why. Why would a man like Douglas Carnegie, ruthless, efficient, pragmatic, care about a child who wasn't his? But he didn't ask. He only sat there, watching. As time passed, Jason learned. He was a quiet child, observant in a way that made the staff uneasy. He listened more than he spoke and watched more than he acted. And most importantly, he learned from Douglas. At first it was simple, listening to the way the man spoke to others, the way he carried himself. But soon, Jason found himself studying the world of business, of power, of how men like Douglas survived where others fell. Douglas never discouraged it. If anything, he seemed to expect it. Books on strategy, economics, even politics appeared in Jason's room. He devoured them, not because he loved them, but because he needed to understand. Why? Because Jason had realized something. He wasn't here because Douglas cared. He was here because Douglas saw something in him, a role to fill, a purpose to serve. And Jason understood that if he wanted to stay, if he wanted to survive, he had to be useful. So he learned, so he watched, so he waited. And Douglas, despite himself, grew fond of the boy who never asked for love, never begged for affection, and never, not even once, asked why he had been abandoned. Because Jason already knew, and he was never going to let it happen again. The rain tapped softly against the wide windows of Douglas Carnegie's study, a rhythmic, hollow sound that filled the silence. The fire crackled, its glow stretching across the dark wood floors, casting long shadows against the high bookshelves. Jason sat across from Douglas, now no longer a child, but a young man with sharp features and a steady, unreadable gaze. The years had carved something different into him, something harder, something controlled. The boy who had once curled beneath blankets, trying to remember what warmth felt like, no longer existed. In his place stood someone precise, deliberate, and far too quiet for his age. Douglas leaned back in his chair, watching Jason carefully. "You've been thinking about it for a long time, haven't you?" Jason said nothing. Douglas sighed, setting his whiskey glass down with a quiet clink. "You're not a boy anymore, and I won't tell you what to do." He studied him for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice lower, weighted with something Jason couldn't quite place. "But I don't want you to do this for me, son." Jason tilted his head slightly. "You think I'm doing it for you?" Douglas held his gaze. Jason exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. "I'm not, Dad." Douglas had never pretended to be a kind man. He had taken Jason in all those years ago, not out of sentiment, but because he had recognized something in the boy. And yet, somewhere in the years that followed, somewhere between calling in doctors for his seizures, teaching him how to outthink men twice his age, and watching him grow into someone neither of them had expected, Douglas had stopped seeing Jason as a tool. He had started seeing him as a son. But Jason wasn't a child anymore, and his mind was set. The Astors still thrived. Their name was still spoken with reverence, their influence stretching through the veins of the city like an unshakable force. They had forgotten him. Jason had not forgotten them. The Astor mansion was lit in gold the night Jason returned. The grand estate stood as it always had, untouched by time, unbothered by its past. Through the towering gates, the garden bloomed with perfectly manicured hedges, fountains trickling softly in the dim glow of lanterns. Inside, the chandeliers blazed with warmth, illuminating the faces of guests who had come to celebrate Caleb Astor's success. Jason stood in the shadows across the street watching. He had expected it, of course. His parents had never been ones to sit in regret. If Lawrence and Kathleen had once grieved the loss of a son, they had buried it beneath silk tablecloths and vintage wine bottles. And Caleb had thrived in Jason's absence. The younger son had been everything they wanted: healthy, charismatic, the perfect heir to the Astor name. a golden boy. Or at least, that was what the world believed. Jason's lips curled slightly as he stepped away from the estate. That illusion wouldn't last long. The club was loud, too bright, too easy. The kind of place where powerful men let their guards down, where trust was traded for expensive liquor and fleeting pleasure. Jason had been watching Caleb for months. He had memorized the way his younger brother moved, the arrogance in his step, the reckless way he carried himself, the way his fingers always twitched when he was losing a bet. Caleb Astor was not his father. He was weaker, and weak men were easy to break. Jason stepped into the club, the bass of the music thrumming under his skin. He moved through the crowd like a ghost, invisible and unnoticed, until he reached the private table in the back. Caleb sat there, a glass in hand, surrounded by people who laughed too loudly at his jokes. His smile was lazy, his pupils just a little too blown. Jason watched, waited. Then, at the right moment, he stepped forward. Caleb barely looked up when Jason sat across from him. The game in front of them was poker, but the real game was something much larger. Jason leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He had introduced himself under a different name, a name Caleb wouldn't recognize, a name that belonged to someone entirely unremarkable. He let Caleb win the first few rounds. Then, slowly, he started playing for real. The drinks flowed, the conversation loosened, and Caleb, drunk on his own superiority, on the illusion of control, never realized that Jason was already inside his world, already weaving himself into the fabric of his trust. By the time the night ended, Jason had what he needed: a connection, an invitation, a way in. Douglas sat in his office when Jason returned that night, the fire burning low. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't have to. Instead, he only looked up when Jason poured himself a drink, something he rarely did. "You met him," Douglas said. It wasn't a question. Jason lifted the glass to his lips, the liquid burning his throat. "He doesn't know who I am." Douglas studied him carefully. "And what's the plan?" Jason set the glass down, watching the way the fire reflected off the surface. "I'm going to destroy him, Dad," he said simply. Douglas said nothing, but after a moment he sighed and reached for his own glass, swirling the whiskey inside before taking a slow sip. "Just don't forget," he said, his voice quieter now. "When you burn something to the ground, you don't always get to walk away untouched." Jason didn't answer. He only watched the fire, his fingers tightening around the glass. He wasn't planning on walking away at all. Do you think Jason's actions were right? If so, leave a comment, Jasmine tea, below. The night was heavy with the scent of whiskey, sweat, and desperation. A haze of cigar smoke clung to the air, curling around the crystal chandeliers of the private gambling hall. It was a world built for excess, where fortunes were won and lost in the flick of a wrist, where men who thought themselves invincible threw their money into the fire just to see how brightly it would burn. Jason sat across from Caleb, his brother oblivious to the shadow lurking at his side. It had been easy, too easy. Caleb was already drowning before Jason had ever stepped into his life. He just hadn't realized it yet. Jason's smile was subtle, patient. His fingers drummed lightly against the felt-covered table as he watched Caleb push another stack of chips forward, his confidence growing with every hand. The alcohol had smoothed the edges of his arrogance, his posture loose, his pupils dilated just enough for Jason to know. This was the moment to strike. The dealer laid down the next set of cards, and Jason barely glanced at his hand. He didn't need to. His real game was unfolding across the table. "Feeling lucky tonight?" Jason mused, watching as Caleb swirled the amber liquid in his glass before downing it in one go. "Luck?" Caleb scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You don't get to my level by relying on luck." Jason's lips barely twitched. "No, I suppose you don't. The cards hit the table and Caleb's grin widened. He barely hesitated before shoving half his stack of chips into the pot. Jason followed. The game stretched on, but the outcome had already been decided. Caleb was bleeding money, but the thrill of the risk had him hooked, drawn in deeper with every loss. Jason had made sure of it. A few nights ago, he had introduced Caleb to the higher stakes tables, nudging him toward risks he hadn't dared take before. And Caleb, so desperate to prove himself, so desperate to be more than just Lawrence Astor's perfect little heir, had taken the bait without hesitation. Jason watched him now, watched as the cracks in his brother's carefully curated image deepened. A few bad hands turned into frustration. Frustration turned into recklessness. And Jason, ever patient, waited. 2 weeks later, Caleb had developed a hunger he couldn't control. Jason made sure of that too. The games became more frequent, the bets higher. Jason always played just well enough to keep Caleb coming back, just poorly enough to let him believe he was better. And in the spaces between the games, between the late nights filled with smoke and liquor, Jason whispered ideas into Caleb's ear. "You ever feel like he's watching you?" Caleb scoffed. "Who?" Jason leaned back in his seat, swirling his drink. "Your father." That single word was enough to make Caleb tense. Jason let the silence stretch between them before speaking again. "I mean, think about it. He's been shaping you to be his heir since birth. He's never going to let you be your own man." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Jason smirked. Must be exhausting, being perfect all the time. Caleb exhaled sharply, downing his drink in one go before signaling for another. Jason watched as the seed he had planted began to take root. Lawrence Astor noticed his son's decline, but not in the way a father should. He saw it in the way Caleb stumbled into the house at dawn, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was watching. He saw it in the growing stack of unpaid debts, in the whispers that followed his son at social gatherings. But Lawrence Astor was not a man who saw failure in his own bloodline. He saw only a problem to be corrected. So he spoke to Caleb the way he had always spoken to Jason, not with warmth, not with concern, but with cold, sharp-edged disappointment. "You need to stop embarrassing this family," Caleb scoffed, tossing his jacket onto the chair. "You think I'm embarrassing you?" Lawrence didn't flinch. "I know you are." For a second, Jason thought Caleb might snap, might finally unleash the resentment Jason had been carefully feeding into him. But then Caleb only smirked, shaking his head. "You don't know anything about me, do you?" Jason almost smiled. The pieces were falling into place. The night it all unraveled, Caleb was already a man drowning. Jason sat across from him at yet another table in yet another exclusive club, watching as Caleb threw his last stack of chips onto the felt. His hands were shaking, sweat gathering at his temple, but his grin was wide. Too wide. Jason tilted his head. "You sure about that bet?" Caleb laughed, loud and reckless. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The final card hit the table. Jason didn't even need to look. Caleb lost. The laughter died in his throat. His fingers curled into the edge of the table, his breathing uneven. He had nothing left. Jason took a slow sip of his drink, watching his brother unravel. Caleb's gaze darted toward the dealer, toward the chips, toward the exit. His mind was already racing, already searching for a way to fix this. But there was no fixing it. Jason had made sure of that. And when Caleb finally looked at him, truly looked at him, desperate, lost, afraid, Jason only smiled. "Welcome to the real world, little brother." Caleb didn't even register the words, too busy drowning in his own ruin. Jason stood, buttoning his jacket with deliberate ease. He leaned down slightly, just enough for Caleb to hear the next part. "Don't worry," Jason murmured. "I'll make sure you have somewhere to land." And then he walked away, leaving Caleb exactly where he wanted him, broken, desperate, and spiraling. Douglas watched Jason from across the study that night, his face unreadable. Jason poured himself a drink, slow and measured. Douglas exhaled. "It's done then." Jason swirled the whiskey in his glass, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "Not yet." Douglas didn't press. He only leaned back in his chair, watching. Jason took a slow sip. It tasted like victory. The first article dropped in the early hours of the morning. A business tabloid, known for catering to the elite, leaked a financial scandal involving none other than Caleb Astor. A series of unpaid gambling debts had surfaced, debts that had quietly piled up under his father's nose. The tone of the article was cautious, speculative almost, but it was enough to light the first match. By noon, the story had spread. Major news outlets picked it up, fleshed it out, and tore it apart. Reports surfaced of Caleb frequenting underground gambling rings, of his excessive spending, his erratic behavior, and his reliance on illicit substances to keep the high going. The headlines were ruthless. The Astor heir, a fall from grace. Lawrence Astor's legacy in jeopardy. As his son spirals the truth behind the Astor family's perfect facade. Jason read each headline with detached amusement. He had spent months collecting the evidence, curating each piece, ensuring that when the fall came, it would be unstoppable. Now, he watched as it unfolded exactly as he had planned. Lawrence Astor was furious. Jason could picture it clearly, the man pacing in his grand office, fingers tight around the phone as he barked orders to his PR team, his lawyers, his people. He was trying to plug the holes in a ship that was already sinking. But Jason knew his father too well. Lawrence didn't believe in damage control. He believed in power. He believed that, with enough money and enough force, anything could be buried. This time, though, Jason had made sure there was nothing left to bury. The financial markets responded immediately. Astor Corp's stock plummeted. Investors began pulling back, their confidence shaken. Lawrence scrambled to stabilize the damage, but the media wouldn't stop. Each day, a new story emerged. Each one is worse than the last. Caleb, in the middle of it all, was drowning. Jason found him exactly where he expected. Alone in a penthouse suite, blinds drawn, surrounded by empty bottles and ashtrays filled with burned-out cigarettes. The moment Jason stepped inside, Caleb looked up. His once polished appearance was gone. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his hands were shaking slightly. But it was his eyes that caught Jason's attention, wide, desperate, a man standing at the edge of a cliff. "You knew, didn't you?" Caleb's voice was hoarse. Jason tilted his head. "Knew what?" Caleb let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "That this was coming." Jason didn't answer. Caleb exhaled sharply, his fingers rubbing at his temples. "I thought we were on the same side." Jason sat down across from him, leisurely pouring himself a drink from the half-empty bottle on the table. "Were we?" Caleb's jaw tightened. His breath was unsteady. "You're the only one who didn't leave. My father won't return my calls. My mother hasn't said a damn thing. My friends—" He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Turns out, I didn't have as many as I thought." Jason watched him unravel, piece by piece. Caleb had always believed himself untouchable. He had lived his life with the safety net of his last name, with the belief that no matter what, he would always have a way out. Jason had taken that from him, and now Caleb was beginning to understand what it meant to be abandoned. Jason leaned forward, swirling the whiskey in his glass. His voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. "You should go to rehab." Caleb froze. Jason took a slow sip. "It's the only way your father will acknowledge you again. If you don't, you'll be nothing but a stain on his record." Caleb scoffed, shaking his head. "You think I care what he thinks?" Jason's smile was almost pitying. "Of course you do." Silence stretched between them. Then, For the first time, Jason saw it, the fight draining from Caleb's posture, the weight of the situation finally settling into his bones. Caleb wasn't just angry anymore. He was tired. Jason set his glass down and stood, adjusting his jacket. "I did what I could," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The rest is up to you." Caleb's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "That's it?" Jason met his gaze, his expression calm. "That's it." And then he turned and walked away. Caleb checked into rehab the next morning. The media framed it as an attempt at redemption, a young heir taking responsibility for his mistakes. But Jason knew the truth. It wasn't about redemption. It was about survival. Lawrence allowed Caleb back into his life, but things had changed. The perfect heir was no longer perfect. His reputation was permanently stained, his influence diminished, and the Astor name would never be the same. That night, Jason sat across from Douglas in the dimly lit study, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. Douglas didn't speak at first. He simply poured Jason a glass of whiskey and pushed it toward him. Jason took it, fingers wrapping around the cold glass. Douglas leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "So, is this what you wanted?" Jason stared at the flames. He had won. He had watched his father scramble. He had watched his mother remain silent, just as she always had. He had watched Caleb lose everything. So why did it feel so empty? Jason took a slow sip of his drink, letting the silence stretch between them. Then finally he spoke. Almost. The Astor estate had never looked so hollow. The chandeliers still cast their golden glow, the marble floors still gleamed under dimmed lighting, but the grandeur had lost its meaning. There were no guests tonight, no laughter, no carefully curated perfection. Just an aging man sitting alone in his study, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. Lawrence Astor sat behind his desk, fingers steepled beneath his chin, staring at nothing. The empire he built was crumbling, and he had no one left to blame but himself. The scandal had ruined his name in ways he hadn't thought possible. The Astor Corp stock continued to fall. Investors had lost confidence. Caleb's reputation was beyond repair, his time in rehab doing little to salvage what was left of his credibility. And Kathleen had locked herself away in their bedroom, the weight of it all suffocating her. Lawrence had spent years ensuring his family was untouchable. Now, they were nothing but a spectacle. A knock at the door shattered the silence. He straightened, rubbing at his temples. "Come in." The door opened slowly. The man who stepped inside was unfamiliar at first glance. Tall, composed, dressed in tailored black. His presence carried an unsettling ease, his movements deliberate. His face, however, Lawrence's brow furrowed. There was something about him. "Who are you?" Jason laughed, a soft, bitter sound that barely reached his eyes. "Of course," he murmured, shaking his head. "Of course, you don't recognize me." Lawrence frowned, but before he could speak again, Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out a single envelope. He placed it on the desk. Lawrence's eyes flickered between the envelope and the man before him. Slowly, he reached for it, tearing open the seal with careful fingers. The moment he saw the contents, his hands stilled. A DNA test. Jason Carnegie var Caleb Astor. Siblings. 99% probability. A name he had long since forgotten. A truth he could no longer deny. Jason watched his father freeze, watched as the blood drained from his face, watched as the truth finally, irrevocably, settled in. He let the silence stretch, let Lawrence feel the weight of what he had done. Finally, Lawrence exhaled, long and slow. Jason tilted his head slightly. "Now you remember." Lawrence looked up, something unreadable in his gaze. "You're alive." Jason let out another quiet, humorless laugh. "Yes, I'm alive." He gestured around the room. Thriving, even. Lawrence opened his mouth as if to say something, but Jason didn't give him the chance. I want you to know something, he said, his voice calm, almost detached. I'm not here to punish you. That's already happened, hasn't it? Lawrence's jaw tensed. Jason took a step closer, bracing his hands against the desk as he leaned in slightly. You left me in the cold, he said, voice measured. You let me believe I was nothing, that I was weak, that I was disposable. His fingers tapped lightly against the wooden surface. But here's the thing, Father. He let the word roll off his tongue like it meant nothing. You were wrong. Lawrence's lips pressed into a thin line. And what? His voice faltered slightly. What do you want from me now? Jason straightened, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. Nothing. Lawrence's brows furrowed. I don't want your money. I don't want your name. I don't want your regret. Jason's gaze was steady, unwavering. I came here because I wanted you to know that I didn't need you. Lawrence swallowed, his shoulders visibly stiff. Jason continued, his tone eerily level. Douglas Carnegie raised me. He taught me everything you never did. He gave me a life, a second chance. Jason's lips curled slightly. The kind of second chance you never would have given me. Lawrence remained silent. Jason studied him for a moment longer before stepping back. You have nothing left to offer me. Nothing I want. Lawrence exhaled sharply, his gaze darkening. Then why are you here? Jason held his stare, his expression unreadable. To watch you live with it. Kathleen's voice came from the doorway. Jason. Jason turned. She looked smaller than he remembered. Her once pristine presence now worn at the edges. Her blue silk robe hung loosely over her frame, her hair pulled back hastily as if she had barely left her room in days. Jason had expected her to look surprised. She didn't. She had known somehow. Maybe not in certainty, but in the back of her mind. She had always known the boy she abandoned had never truly disappeared. Jason didn't say anything. Neither did she. The moment stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then Jason turned back to Lawrence. There's nothing left to say. With that, he walked away. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty hall as he left behind the house he had once called home, leaving its occupants to drown in their own silence. The Astor name had once been untouchable, a dynasty built on power, control, and the unwavering belief that they were above consequence. But all dynasties fall, and Jason had made sure this one crumbled from the inside. The headlines had not stopped. The scandal had become more than just a temporary stain. It had festered, grown into something that couldn't be erased. Investors had pulled out of Astor Corp one after another. The once unshakable family business was now teetering on the edge of financial collapse. Caleb was gone, shut away in a luxury rehab facility. The media spun stories of redemption, but Jason knew there was no coming back from the kind of disgrace Caleb had endured. Lawrence was a broken man. The ruthless, commanding presence he had once carried had withered into something hollow. His empire was collapsing, his influence unraveling, and the reality of his own failures hung over him like a noose. Kathleen had disappeared into herself, her carefully maintained facade shattered. She no longer made public appearances. The perfect wife, the perfect mother, an image she had so desperately tried to uphold, was gone. The Astor family had not been defeated by an external enemy, by a rival, or by a scandal manufactured by an outsider. They had done this to themselves. Jason had simply been there to pull the final string. He sat in Douglas Carnegie's study that night, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Douglas, across from him, had been silent for a long time. Finally, he sighed, setting his whiskey glass down. "You've done what you came to do." Jason didn't respond. Douglas leaned forward slightly, studying him. "And yet, You don't look like a man who just won. Jason's fingers tapped against the side of his glass. He had won. The family that had discarded him and left him to die had finally collapsed under the weight of their own mistakes. Then why did he feel so empty? Douglas exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You think I don't recognize it? Jason looked up, his gaze sharp. I know what it's like to hold on to something like this for too long. Douglas leaned back in his chair. And I know that once the revenge is over, once you've taken everything from the people who hurt you, you're left standing in the wreckage and realizing there's nothing left. Jason's jaw tightened. Douglas sighed. I raised you better than this. Jason let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Did you? Douglas didn't blink. Yes. Jason swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the way the firelight reflected off the amber liquid. He had spent his whole life chasing this moment. Every step he had taken, every carefully laid plan had led him here. And yet, the satisfaction was fleeting. Douglas watched him for a long moment. Then he spoke again, voice lower, firmer. Let it go, Jason. Oh, I should call you my son. Jason exhaled slowly. Douglas leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. You burned them to the ground. They have to live with their shame, their regret. That's their punishment. But what about you? Jason didn't answer, because for the first time in years, he didn't know. Days passed. Weeks. The Astor name continued to rot, its legacy reduced to nothing more than whispered disgrace. Jason didn't go back. He didn't need to. The past no longer held anything for him. But for the first time, the future felt just as uncertain. Douglas had been right about one thing. When you burn something to the ground, you don't always get to walk away untouched. The morning was quiet. For the first time in years, Jason had nothing left to plan. No more steps to calculate, no more moves to make. The pieces had already fallen into place, and now, all that remained was the silence after the storm. He stood in his room, methodically folding his clothes into a suitcase. Not a grand departure, not an escape, just the quiet act of leaving. His hands moved with precision, but there was no urgency. He wasn't running. He was simply done. The study door was slightly ajar when he passed by. Inside, Douglas sat at his desk, a glass of whiskey beside him, a cigar resting in the tray. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't smoking. He was waiting. Jason stopped at the threshold. You knew I was leaving. Douglas smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. You don't pack that neatly unless you've made up your mind. Jason stepped inside, letting the door fall shut behind him. Douglas studied him for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. So, where's the next chapter, kid? Jason exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know. Douglas raised an eyebrow. You always know. Jason hesitated, then shrugged. Not this time. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, filling the space between them. Douglas sighed, fingers drumming against the armrest. You could stay. You built a life here. No one's pushing you out. Jason let out a soft breath, a half smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You're not the type to keep a man caged, Douglas. Douglas huffed. No, I'm not. But I also don't let men walk off cliffs without saying something first. Jason met his gaze. Douglas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. Listen to me, Jason. You spent years chasing a ghost. I watched you lay the foundation, brick by brick, of this grand revenge. And I didn't stop you because... He exhaled, shaking his head. Hell, maybe I wanted to see them fall just as much as you did. Jason didn't argue. But now it's over. Douglas's voice softened. And I need you to ask yourself something. Jason tilted his head. Douglas's gaze never wavered. Who are you without this? Jason's fingers curled slightly at his sides. You spent years knowing exactly what you were fighting against, Douglas continued. But now, it's just you. No goal, no enemy, no next step. He gestured slightly. So where does that leave you? Jason exhaled slowly. I don't know. Douglas nodded, as if he had expected that answer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Douglas leaned back, a quiet smirk playing at his lips. You know, I told myself I wouldn't say this. He let out a slow breath. But you're the best damn thing I ever took in. Jason's chest tightened, not painfully, but in a way that felt foreign, unfamiliar. He didn't have words for it, so he didn't try. Instead, he stepped forward, and for the first time in his life, extended his hand first. Douglas blinked at it, then let out a short, gruff laugh before clasping Jason's hand. It was a handshake, yes, but it was more than that. It was recognition. It was understanding. It was a goodbye without needing to say the word. Jason turned toward the door. You'll always have a place here, Douglas said behind him, his voice steady. Jason glanced back, nodding once. Then he left. The air outside was crisp, the morning sky painted in muted blues and greys. Jason stepped out onto the quiet streets, his suitcase rolling lightly against the pavement. He didn't look back. For the first time, he wasn't walking toward revenge. He wasn't walking toward the past. He was simply walking forward. The town was quiet, wrapped in the scent of salt and morning bread. Jason stepped off the last bus with nothing but a suitcase in one hand and a quiet resolve in the other. For the first time in his life, there was no grand plan, no strategy, no next move. Just the open road and the whisper of the sea calling him forward. The orphanage sat on the outskirts of town, nestled near the cliffs where the waves stretched endlessly. It was not a grand building, not polished, not new. The paint was peeling, the wooden fence leaned in places, and the windows rattled when the wind was strong. But it was full of life. Children ran barefoot through the yard, their laughter spilling through the open air, untamed and bright. Jason stood at the gate, watching them, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He hadn't planned to stop here, hadn't planned for anything beyond leaving, yet something held him still. A small voice broke his thoughts. Are you lost? Jason turned. A girl, no older than 7, stood in front of him, her dress wrinkled, her curly hair wild from the wind. She squinted up at him, hands on her hips, as if she were challenging him to answer correctly. Jason hesitated. No. She frowned. Then why do you look like you don't know where you're going? Jason blinked. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Small, barely there, but real. Days passed, and Jason found himself staying, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because, somehow, he no longer wanted to leave. The children pulled him into their world without hesitation. They didn't ask where he had come from, didn't ask why his eyes sometimes held too much silence. They simply accepted him. And Jason, in return, found himself doing something unfamiliar. He stayed. One afternoon, as he repaired a broken fence, a boy, no older than 10, watched him with narrowed eyes. You're bad at this, the boy declared. Jason raised an eyebrow. And you're an expert? The boy crossed his arms. I help fix things all the time. Want me to show you? Jason handed him a hammer. Be my guest. The boy scrambled forward, eagerly taking over. Jason watched, amusement flickering through him. He was used to people trying to prove themselves in boardrooms, with money, with power. But here, proving oneself meant knowing how to hammer a nail straight. It was a different kind of world, and Jason was starting to like it. Evenings were quieter. The children would gather for dinner, their voices filling the dining hall with stories of the day. Jason sat at the far end of the table, listening more than speaking, until one night, a small hand tugged at his sleeve. Why don't you talk much? Jason looked down. The little girl from the gate, Chloe, tilted her head, waiting. Jason hesitated, then said softly, "I wasn't always around people like this." Chloe frowned. "Like what?" Jason gestured around them. "Loud, kind." Chloe considered this. Then, with all the certainty of a child, she declared, "You should talk more. I bet you have good stories." Jason exhaled a soft chuckle. "Maybe." She grinned. "Will you tell me one?" Jason thought for a moment, then nodded. "Tomorrow." Chloe beamed. "Promise." Jason met her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, he gave a promise he meant to keep. The sun had nearly set when Jason walked down to the shore that evening. The wind was strong, carrying the scent of salt through the air. He sat on the cool sand, letting the waves roar before him. For years, his mind had been a battlefield. Every step had been taken toward something, toward revenge, toward proving he was more than what he had been left as. Now, for the first time, there was nowhere he needed to go. Footsteps crunched in the sand behind him. "You left dinner early." Jason glanced over his shoulder. Chloe stood there, her arms crossed. "You eat too slow," Jason replied. She wrinkled her nose. "You didn't tell me a story." Jason sighed, shaking his head. "You don't forget things, do you?" "Nope." She plopped down beside him, hugging her knees. "I like it here." "Do you?" Jason looked at the horizon, where the sky met the sea. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I think I do." Chloe grinned. "Then you should stay." Jason didn't answer right away. The waves crashed against the shore, the air heavy with salt and something else, something lighter than he had felt in years. He turned to her, his voice quieter. "Maybe I will." And for the first time, Jason wasn't running toward revenge. He wasn't chasing ghosts. He was just here. And maybe that was enough. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.